Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the module A328. How do empires begin? Page 322. Imperial ideologies and cultures of empire, but they were gradually extended over time to apply to other populations too. Some of these demonstrate very clearly how racist discourses of difference were embedded into legislation to practical effect. Consider, for example, the legislation passed in 1661 by the Parliament of Barbados, legislation that was commonly referred to as Barbados Slave Code, while on the service setting out certain standards of treatment for enslaved Africans. Really, it simply provided a legal basis for slavery in the colony. It both represented and codified a racist view of enslaved Africans as health, Hennish, brutish, and an uncertain dangerous people. Bernard, 1996. Barbados Code. Barbados Code served as a model for those of a number of the other British colonies in the Caribbean. By the 19th century, the operation of British law in colonial context was more complex. For example, in India, British legal jurisdiction initially only extended to British subjects, but only in the latter part of the century. Administrators began to assume legal authority over the whole population, and the British legal system began to interface with the incorporate certain aspects of indigenous legal systems. From the 1860s, a new Indian Penal Code was introduced into British India, although it didn't always cover the princely states, areas of India, not ruled directly by Britain but bound by treaty to the British Crown. The law had a dual aspect at this point. On the one hand, the way it was enforced by British officials, of course, could serve to reinforce nations of superiority and difference. From Martin Weiner, for example, the laxity of justice when Indians were killed by Europeans was in contrast to the excessive vigour when, as happened more rarely, a European was killed. On the other hand, as the century wore on, Weiner argues that while the Indian Penal Code still served white supremacy in many ways, it was increasing a resource that colonial populations could draw on, albeit unequally. That said, the very act of the drawing on the mechanism and institutions of colonial rule can be seen as an act of subjugation to Western authority, even if the outcomes of trials occasionally went against the British. Thus, it is possible to see law in the British Empire as both an expression of supremacy and difference and a mechanism that helped ensure the continued function of the empire. Scientific discourse is another area in which notions of cultural superiority and difference became embedded with real-world effects. By scientific discourse, I'm not referring here to texts primarily focused on race theory, but on the broader development of scientific understandings that nevertheless contain obvious preconceptions around racial superiority and difference. The historical literature on this topic is huge, but there is a general agreement among historians on the close links between scientific knowledge, presented as objective but in fact imbued with the same notions of difference, and superiority we have been discussing, and the maintenance of empires, as a MacLeod notes in the case of Britain. Science became a key aspect of a global intelligence system, which served best the interest of those best placed to receive its data. Science became a Colonising ideology. This was equally true for France. Edouard de Martoni, for example, author of the 1930 text Le Savant Colonel, was clear the colonial scientists are agents for the propagation of French culture. As a discrete example of this, consider the notion of martial races expressed in Britain during the 19th century, while developed by military officers as much as by scientists. It was believed that the population of different areas of India and elsewhere in the empire had different physical and mental characteristics, for example. During the recruitment of soldiers across India, Punjabi Sikhs were viewed as naturally brave and warlike. And Nepalese Gurkhas, a term applied to British to culturally diverse subsets of the Nepalese men who did not originally self-identify as Gurkha, were regarded as hardy and loyal. Those living in the West and South India were seen to lack courage and be of diminutive physique. Communities inhabited colder frontier regions, by contrast, were considered more suited to combat. Such ideas draw partly on claims by the West European medical practitioners from the 18th century as to what constituted healthy and unhealthy localities, with the former generally being regions where the climate resembled that of Britain. Martial race theory also drew on so-called Aryan invasion theory, the notion that slender, light-skinned Aryans from northern Eurasia had successfully invaded India in ancient times. In essence, however, exponents of martial race theory were very much expressing a broader scientific understanding in which the biological and moral qualities of race were seen as qualities that could be used to justify forms of knowledge useful to the empire. As Khurshid Roy, he argues the colonial authorities constructed knowledge about their populations and their populative or non-populative martial qualities in a way that underpinned imperial rule, essentially a kind of divide and rule approach. As he notes, the construction of martial races embedded the British to play different communities against each other to prevent the emergence of a unified anti-British sentiment among the colonised. Another site where ideas about racial difference and superiority can be tracked is in political debates and pronouncements. In many ways, a function of politics is to draw on prevalent popular ideas and translate these into material actions. How do the words spoken by these two important politicians demonstrate embedded ideas of superiority and difference? Page 324. Speech given to the House of Commons by the former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour in 1910. Western nations, as soon as they emerge into history, show the beginnings of those capacities for self-government. You may look through the whole history of the Orientals in what is called, broadly speaking, the East, and you will never find trace of self-government. All their great centuries, and they have been very great, have been passed under despotisms, under absolute government. All their great contributions to civilization, and they have been great, have been made under that form of government. Conqueror has succeeded conqueror. One domination had followed another, but never in all the revolutions of fate and fortune have you seen one of those nations of its own motion establish what we, from the Western point of view, call self-government. It is a good thing for these great nations, I admit their greatness, that this absolute government should be exercised by us. I think it is a good thing. I think that experience shows that they have got under it far better government than in the whole history of the world they have had before, and which not only is a benefit to them, but is undoubtedly a benefit to the whole of the civilized West. We are in Egypt, not merely for the sake of the Egyptians, though we are there for their sake. We are there also for the sake of Europe at large. Speech given in France by Jules Ferry in 1885, the superior races have a right of vis-a-vis the inferior races. I repeat that the superior races have a right because they have a duty towards them. They have a duty to civilize the inferior races. Can anyone deny that there is more justice, more order, material and moral, more equity, more social virtue in North Africa since France conquered it? Can it be denied that in India, despite the shameful episodes which form part of the history of that conquest, there is today infinity more justice, more light, more order, more public and private virtue since the English conquest than before? Overall, this section has demonstrated that imperial ideologies, which include the belief in a hierarchy of races and civilizing mission for European empires, were not just abstract doctrines. Many broader forms of knowledge embodied and transmitted this imperial outlook. Races' ideas of difference were often encoded into laws and legal frameworks. Scientific thinking, as developed in the Western nations, the 19th century in particular, also embodied and reinforced imperial ideologies, and political discourse was a further way in which ideas were translated into actions. First, it can be often helpful as historians to reflect on our own unconsciousness, assumptions, and biases. You're about to consider the extent to which the bulk of metropolitan populations were aware of the French and British empires. Thinking about yourself, answering the following questions: how much would you say the history of British Empire has informed your worldview? Had you ever thought about it before starting this module? If prompted to think about the British Empire, what are your own thoughts, assumptions, and views about it? Thinking about those living in Britain and France at the end of the 19th century, the bulk of whom would never have travelled to the colonies, make a list of all the different ways you think they might have, consciously or unconsciously, found out about empire. In other words, what are your assumptions as to how individuals form views and opinions about empire? An important question that historians have debated is the extent to which bulk of the metropolitan population was influenced by imperial ideologies and the broader ecologies of knowledge in which they were embedded. It seems clear that those involved in the business of empire, politicians, administrators, settlers, traders, soldiers, may well have incorporated notions of difference and superiority into their everyday habitus. But what about others in the metropole? Did they care or even know how much about the empire? Early work on the significance of imperialism in metropolitan context was undertaken by John Mackenzie, editor of the Studies in Imperialism series produced by Manchester University Press. He and others sought to investigate the ways in which imperialism as a cultural phenomenon had as significant as an effect on the dominant as on the subordinate societies. The conclusion of such historians was that of the pervasiveness of empires in entertainment, education, and social activity in Britain. This reveals cultural practices as inseparable from the political and economic dimensions of imperialism. This position was subsequently critiqued by Bernard Porter and others, who claimed that, whatever else it may have been, the British Empire in the earlier 19th century was not a people's empire. Rather, they argued the impact of empire, while greater during the 19th century than previously, was still mainly confined to the upper and middle classes. For Porter, there was no direct evidence that the working classes supported the empire. It took an interest in it, or were even aware of it for the most of the century. For him, the British were absent-minded imperialists. The title of Porter's book, The Absent-Minded Imperialist, references a lecture given in 1885 by the historian John Seeley, in which he declared that the British had acquired their empire, in a fit of absence of mind. The debate over how far imperial ideology shaped the world view of different groups, elite and working class, continues. Some recent research has taken a more neutral stance, with imperial ideology usually seen as neither ambitious or non-existent. From Scott 2014, but Mackenzie 2022, page 316, has recently reaffirmed his view that the dominant elite of the British Empire had a yearning for a unified imperial culture, propagated through a range of cultural forms. Recent research has also focused on visual sources and material objects, in addition to print, as important vectors for the transmission of imperial motifs and ideas. For see example from Longear and McAleer 2012 and Mackenzie 2021. In relation to France, early historical investigations of the empire tended to downplay the significance of imperial ideology on the metropolitan populations, arguing that in its depths, France was not colonial in the 19th or 20th centuries. Argument, then a new wave of scholarship took a different view, portraying the empire as ambitious and of great significance in French history. As in the UK, a more nuanced position had subsequently emerged while the empire was certainly in the air everywhere in France, and from the mid-19th century onward. It permeated metropolitan consciousness in a host of different ways and, no doubt, to different degrees, eliciting a very wide spectrum of reactions. My own view is that some of the debate misses the point. If we understand habitus as being created without deliberate intent and without consciousness awareness on the part of those who enact it, then it does not really matter whether those who are imbibe and embody an imperial ideology are conscious of doing so. Let's explore this assertion a little more. We can do this via an examination of print culture, which is arguably the most important way in which ordinary people encountered ideas about empire. If we examine print culture, what does it tell us about the ubiquity of an imperial ideology in 19th and 20th century France and Britain? While in one sense print culture has existed since the invention of print, the 19th century witnessed a massive expansion in the availability of and market for printed publication of all types: books, pamphlets, newspapers, novels, plays, handbills, advertisements. As time progressed, print increasingly incorporated pictures, engravings, and then photographs, black and white and then colour. This medium was eventually joined by radio, but it is undoubtedly print formats that supplied most of the public with entertainment information. And both were riddled with imperial motives and assumptions. You will learn more about print culture and empire in Block 4, but for now, consider the primary sources reproduced below. What strikes you about these sources given what you know about how imperial ideologies? The colonies then and now, one of the most striking contrasts between the beginning of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century is a difference in the part played by the British colonies. 100 years ago, Great Britain stood almost alone. We now find prosperous and powerful British colonies in almost every quarter of the globe. Canada has grown into a young but sturdy nation. Australia is on the foothold of nationhood. The British Empire in India now extends far beyond the limits on the sway exercised by the greatest of the Mughals. So far as all outward evidence goes, India is as loyal to the British Crown as any portion of Her Majesty's dominions. In the West Indies, superficially, the contrast is not so favourable. Then the islands were in the enjoyment of the artificial prosperity based upon slave labour. Now they no longer yield princely fortunes to the British capitalist, but on the other hand, the slaves of the past have been succeeded by a large population of free men who appear to be in the enjoyment of very considerable present prosperity, with an outlook of great improvement in the near future. A whoop of war cry, half shriek, half yell, startled the silence of the forest. Whiz, whiz, whiz came the spears. The night seemed to be full of dusky faces and brandished arms, and then something or other descend with a crack upon my head, and I felt as though sinking into the earth. When I regained my senses, of which I had been deprived by a blow from a club or waddy, I found myself lying on the grass in a little dell, having a water hole in its centre, surrounded by trees of enormous girth and height, under one of which I noticed a donkey and cart, whilst my unfortunate partner lay bound with green whiffies under another, with his head all bloody. There was revealed to be by a circle of blazing fires, and close in the rear of one, a lot of women and old men were squatted, cross-legged on the grass, making a horrible noise and jawbones of some animals, which they clashed together with all their might, whilst, with the shrilliest of voices, they kept up a really ear-splitting accompaniment, whilst I wondered whether it was our funeral dirge, which they were chanting as a kind of preliminary ceremony to be cutting of our throats, either the rustling of countless leaves or the parting of a naked feet attracted my attention, coming from another direction, and a minute later rushed through the interstices between the watchfires, and in many instances leaping over the flames came evidently the warriors of tribe, yelling, gesticulating, and brandishing spears, boomerangs, waddies, and nullas, both forms of wooden club, the foam flying in every direction, from their parted lips and from their long matted elf locks, fluttering with every emotion, like intertangled and riffing serpents. So, to recap the argument I presented throughout this section, Imperial Ideologies legitimate domination of other peoples and conquest settlement over the land and resources. They did this by setting up a discourse of difference and pursuing the hierarchy of civilization and trees. These ideologies were not found just in abstract texts, but become embedded in a wide range of knowledge legal systems, including political and scientific discourses. During the 19th and 20th centuries, significant efforts were made to promote the acceptance of continuation of empires to metropolitan populations, and imperial motives were found in all forms of print culture of the period. All of above contributed an imperial infection to the inhabitants. As Christopher Bailyn claims, the ideology of empire formative and contribute to longevity empire as economic, military, as political factors. You will now explore in more detail the activities in section 2. Hybridity and resistance overview. As we have already learned, empires were very rarely, and only in specific locations, ruled directly by force. In Uganda in 1890s, for example, there were only 20 British residents, nationally governing a population of around 3 million. Even in the 1940s, there were fewer than 1,000 imperial officials in the whole of the Sub-Saharan Africa. This unit is concerned with how ideologies and cultures of empire contributed to the maintenance of empires. We have considered the way in which the imperial habitus, or mindset developed in the metropolitan context, legitimising a broad range of actions, many of them violent or oppressive. In colonial territories, this is part of the explanation of how ideas and culture contribute to the functioning of empire, but actually, the answer to this question of who ran the empire, of course, is that it was the colonised themselves. The concept of hybridity, as developed within the post-colonial theory, is important here. Hybridity refers to the mixing of cultures, ideas, and identities that occurs as the result of cultural contacts. This is relevant to our discussion of how empires work because it helps to explain how, as Christian Kuhlman notes, there is often a symbiotic rather than a purely oppositional relationship between ruler and ruled. Kuhlman, 2021. This is not to imply the metropole-colony relationships were ever ones of equality. It is important not to forget the overt power imbalances with empires, but equally to see the maintenance of empires as only underpinned by ideology developed in metropoles is an oversimplification. The concept of hybridity attempts to capture the interaction of culture and identity that took place between metropoles and colonies, but does not refer to just as my emphasis. Given mixing of the cultural materials, backgrounds, or identities, rather it implies a markedly unbalanced relationship. Also relevant here is the resistance to empire that arose in certain places and all at certain times. Obviously, resistance to empires is usually associated with their unravelling, and you'll certainly consider this in much more detail in Block 5. How do empires decline, end, and persist? But even when empires appeared at their strongest, there was always resistance of various types. This included culture or ideological resistance, seeing the world differently and resisting imperial worldview. Arguably, however, some cultural resistance was functional to the maintenance of empires. A function of the hybrid culture of empires, it aimed to change or reform rather to end them. Both hybridity and resistance meant that imperial cultures and ideologies were never simply static and imposed from the metropole. Rather, they were the result of a complex interplay between the imperial ambitions and assumptions and local colonial cultures of accommodation and resistance. Understanding this interplay is important to any explanation of how empires worked. This section is of the unit, therefore, will consider how hybridity and resistance I'm not sure what happened here. Well, I'll leave it there. Not quite sure what happened there, but there we go. Both